In the spring of 1971, 26-year-old Evelyn Marsh inherited 28 fields of kudzu from a grandfather who had stopped fighting the vine about 15 years before he died. And by the time the deed passed to her, the fields had stopped being fields in any meaningful sense of the word and had become something else entirely. Kudzu moves at a rate that defies reasonable belief. A single vine can grow a foot a day in the high heat of a Kentucky summer, and over the 12 years her grandfather had let it run, it had consumed fence lines and utility poles and the skeletons of old farm equipment left in the open, covered them the way the ocean covers a wreck, smoothly and completely, until you could walk the perimeter of a field and see nothing but an unbroken green surface rolling across the land like a tide that had decided to stop where it was. The fields themselves were invisible beneath it. Their edges, their contours, the old crops, all of it gone under a blanket of leaf and stem and tangled root that had built up 3 feet of layered growth above the original soil surface. You could not walk into it. You could not see into it. In the summer it was a living wall of green. In the winter, when the vine died back and left its brown mats of spent growth, it was a landscape of dead ruin, the outlines of the old topography visible beneath the collapsed mass, the way a body is visible beneath a sheet. The neighbors had opinions about this, as neighbors in farming country always do. The consensus on the Marsh place had been forming for years before Evelyn arrived. It was, in the county's settled judgment, a waste. The ground itself might have been something once, but kudzu was a one-way door. You got in, but you didn't get out without more money and equipment and time than the land could ever repay. The sensible thing, everyone agreed, was to sell it, take whatever the market would give for the acreage, and get out from under a burden that would otherwise define the next decade of a young woman's life. The most direct statement of this view came from a man named Ray Cutler, who farmed a clean 300 acres on the north side of the county road that bordered Evelyn's land. He was not a cruel man, but he was a confident one, with the particular confidence of a person whose land has always done what he asked it to do. He said what he said in the hardware store, and it traveled the usual distance. That Marsh girl's going to try to farm kudzu fields. She's 26 years old, and she's got 28 fields of vine, and she doesn't know yet that there's nothing to be done with it. He had not been laughing when he said it. Ray Cutler didn't quite laugh at people, but the sentence had landed like a joke, and by the end of the week it had been repeated in tones that made it sound funnier each time. The county agricultural extension agent, a man named Mr. Doyle, who carried a clipboard with the practiced authority of someone who has been explaining things to farmers for 20 years, stopped by that first spring. He walked the perimeter of the nearest field with Evelyn and made notes and pursed his lips in the expression a professional wears when he has already reached his conclusion. Chemical treatment was the standard approach for kudzu management, but the scale of her infestation made it prohibitively expensive. Mechanical removal was possible in principle, but impractical without sustained equipment investment. The realistic timeline for returning the land to productive use through conventional means was, in his professional estimation, 10 to 15 years, assuming she started immediately and had sufficient capital. "What capital I have," Evelyn said, "is not sufficient for that." Mr. Doyle nodded, unsurprised. He mentioned 2 agencies that might assist with land rehabilitation that he knew, from experience, were chronically underfunded and difficult to work with. He said all of this with the professional courtesy of a man delivering a terminal diagnosis who wants the patient to feel that all options have been presented. "Thank you," Evelyn said, and she meant it, because she had needed to understand what conventional wisdom said before she could decide how much of it to follow. She had grown up spending summers at her grandfather's farm before the kudzu took it, and there were things she remembered that had stayed with her in the specific way that childhood observation stays, not as formal knowledge, but as wordless familiarity with a place. She remembered the shape of the land under the vine, the hills and hollows where the old fences had been. And she remembered something else, mentioned once and never again her grandfather, walking with her through the orchard when she was perhaps 9, pointing south toward the largest of the kudzu-covered hills and saying something about a stone barn his own grandfather had built. He had said it the way old men mention things that are no longer relevant, in passing, as a piece of family history rather than a practical fact. Evelyn had looked at the hill of Kudzu, thought the usual things a 9-year-old thinks, and moved on. Now, she stood on the perimeter of the same hill, 20 years later, and looked at it the way a person looks at something they have been trying to remember. Let me explain what she understood that the extension agent and Ray Cutler and the hardware store consensus did not. They looked at Kudzu and saw a problem, and they were not wrong that it was a problem. But they saw it as only a problem, which meant their only question was how to eliminate it. That framing committed them, before they had done anything else, to an expensive, prolonged war against something that was very good at being fought. Evelyn looked at Kudzu and saw a resource with a problem attached to it, which is a different thing entirely. Kudzu is, among other qualities, extremely high in protein. It is palatable to livestock. Goats, in particular, will eat it with the focused, contented persistence of animals that have found exactly what they are looking for. They eat the leaves, the stems, the new growth. They eat around the roots. They clear ground methodically over time in a way that no machine can replicate at the small scale of a hillside or a hollow, because machines cannot go everywhere and goats can. This was not a secret. It was documented in scattered publications and in the practical experience of farmers here and there who had tried it. But it was not the approach that the Mr. Doyles of the world recommended, because it was slow and it was unconventional, and it did not fit the industrial logic of the systems those men had been trained to work within. It required patience rather than capital, which made it invisible to everyone who was measuring the problem in dollars and years. It also required an understanding of what was under the kudzu, which was something only Evelyn had, imperfect and half-remembered as that understanding was. She spent the summer of 1971 reading everything she could find about goat husbandry and kudzu management, driving to the county library in the evenings after days of clearing access paths and mending what fences were still mendable along the edges of the property. She wrote to 2 agricultural schools and received polite responses that confirmed what she had already found. The approach was reasonable in principle. The timeline would be measured in years. The outcome was not guaranteed. She noted that none of the letters told her it was impossible. She drove to a farm 40 miles east in September and bought her first herd 27 goats, a mixed group of Boer crosses and Spanish goats chosen for hardiness and browsing appetite, and she brought them back in a borrowed trailer and turned them into the most accessible of the kudzu fields on a cool morning in October, while Ray Cutler's truck happened to be passing on the county road. Let me stop and ask you something. Have you ever started something that the entire world around you considered pointless? Not cruel or foolish exactly, but simply pointless, a waste of your limited years, and felt, despite all of that, the specific, quiet certainty that comes not from confidence in the outcome, but from confidence that you are asking the right question. That was where Evelyn stood on the edge of her first kudzu field on an October morning in 1971, watching 27 goats disappear into the green. The first season established a rhythm that would not change for years. Evelyn moved the goats between fields according to a rotation she worked out by trial and observation in the first months, learning how quickly a group could clear an area of manageable growth, how long to let them rest a section before bringing them back. The work was unglamorous and solitary. She was out before sunrise most mornings and did not come in until after dark. She mended gaps in the fencing constantly because goats are explorers by nature, and the kudzu boundary was not a wall but a suggestion. She kept records from the beginning, a habit absorbed from her grandfather's journals, which she had found in the farmhouse and which showed, in his cramped handwriting, decades of observation about the property she could cross-reference against what she was seeing herself. The neighbors watched. Not with malice, mostly, but with the particular watchfulness of farming people who are always alert to the outcomes of decisions made on adjacent land, because in a landscape where everyone shares weather and watershed and the slow fluctuations of the county's agricultural health, what one farmer does has a way of mattering to the ones around them. Ray Cutler drove the county road with more frequency than his usual schedule required in those first 2 years, and his reports at the hardware store were mixed. The goats were working, that much was visible, but the scale of the problem and the pace of the solution made the outcome seem perpetually distant. "She's making progress," he would allow, in the tone of a man who considers progress without an arrival date the same as standing still. By the end of the second full season, 4 of the 28 fields had been cleared to soil exposed, the old contours of the land readable for the first time in a decade. Evelyn walked those 4 fields in November and crouched and pulled up handfuls of the underlying material. The soil underneath the kudzu mat was not what she had feared. Kudzu, for all its invasive ferocity, fixes nitrogen. The ground beneath decades of the vine was dark and dense with organic matter, richer than the surrounding crop fields that had been plowed and replanted for 40 years. She mailed samples to the extension office without any message, and when the results came back, they confirmed what her hands had already told her. The soil under the kudzu was better than the soil around it. She added this to her records. The herd grew. By the spring of 1974, there were 61 goats working the Marsh property under a management system she had refined through 3 years of direct observation. The cleared fields were beginning to show the early growth of native grasses that had survived in the soil's seed bank beneath the kudzu. She planted pasture seed in the 2 most completely cleared fields that spring and by autumn had working pasture where there had been kudzu wall. Ray Cutler drove past in October and slowed for a long moment before continuing on. She had learned, by the 3rd year, that she did not need to watch for it. Then came the morning in the early spring of 1975 that changed everything. She noticed it first as a behavior deviation, because after 3 years of watching the herd she knew its patterns, the way you come to know any living system you observe every day, which animals led and which followed, which sections of vine they preferred, and in what order, how they gathered at water in the evenings. The deviation was subtle at first, a clustering of the older animals along the western face of the largest remaining kudzu hill, the one that rose sharply at the back of the property and that she had left until last, because the grade made fencing difficult. On a morning in March, she came out to find the whole herd pressed against the western face of that hill, not browsing, just standing. 30, then 40 animals collected along a specific section of slope, their heads oriented toward a particular point in the hillside, simply present and attentive in the way that herd animals are attentive when something has registered in them that has not yet registered in the person watching. She tried moving them. They went where she pushed them and drifted back. She tried again the next morning. Same section of hillside, same uncharacteristic stillness. On the 3rd morning, she walked up to see what they were looking at. The kudzu on the western face of that hill had been worked longer than she'd realized. The animals had been grazing the accessible portions since the previous autumn, and the vine mat on the lower section had been reduced to a shallow layer over whatever lay beneath. She saw the edge of it first, a line of cut stone running horizontal to the ground at about knee height, exposed where the goats had been working hardest. She thought it was a retaining wall. Then she pulled back more of the dead vine mat above it with her hands and found another course of stone above the first, and above that another, and then she was standing back and looking at what was revealing itself to her and understanding, in the slow, accumulating way that a fact becomes real when it is larger than you expected, what she was looking at. The stones were hand-cut, limestone, fitted without mortar in the tight, careful pattern of a skilled mason. The wall rose 6 feet out of the hillside where she had cleared it and ran laterally at least 40 feet in each direction. Above the visible wall, her hands in the vine mat found more stone, a slight overhang, a different angle. What she understood, after a moment of not understanding, was the base of a roof edge. The hill was not a hill. The western face of it was a wall. She went back to the farmhouse and found her grandfather's journals, looking for what she now knew must be there, and on a page from 1938, she found it. The old stone barn on the south hill is so far undermined now that I have given up the thought of clearing it in my lifetime. It was my grandfather's barn, and before that his father's, built, I believe, in the 1860s. The stone is good, and the walls will last longer than anything I am likely to build. Below that, in a different season's ink, tried again with the south hill. It is beyond me. She closed the journal and looked out the window at the hill. It took the better part of 2 weeks to clear enough of the vine and the decades of organic debris to understand what she had found. She did not call anyone for those 2 weeks, except a neighbor who helped her reinforce the temporary fencing she set up to give herself working room on the hillside. She worked her way across the face of it methodically, from the exposed wall section outward in both directions, pulling back the dead mat and the tangled root mass with a mattock in her hands, exposing the stonework course by course, until the shape of the building was clear. The barn was massive. The structure was perhaps 120 feet long and 40 feet wide, set into the hillside so that its back wall was the stone face of the slope and its front wall stood free, the Kudzu having climbed and consumed it entirely, filling the interior over decades with accumulated debris until the floor level had risen by 4 feet and made the building invisible from outside as anything but a hill. The roof line was still intact along most of its length, the original hand-split wooden shingles long gone but the stone gables standing clean and straight. She found the door on the southern end, its wooden frame rotted away but its stone arch perfectly intact. She cleared enough debris to get inside, and she went in. Let me tell you what she found in there, because it is the part of the story that changed everything about what Evelyn understood herself to have inherited. On a stone shelf along the interior of the east wall, protected from the worst of the decades of moisture by the solid mass of the hillside behind it, she found a wooden crate. Inside, wrapped in what had once been oilcloth, were documents. She brought them outside and spread them on the cleared stone wall section and read what she could of them. They were farm records, written in a hand she did not recognize, covering the 1880s and 1890s. Not simple accounts of yields and expenses, the records of a systematic breeding program for a line of cattle her family had been developing for 3 decades, with notes on crossing strategy, feed ratios, seasonal management, and the particular qualities they were selecting for generation by generation. There were diagrams of the barn's interior layout and its function as a working operation. There were correspondence copies addressed to buyers in Louisville and Cincinnati, and one, to her considerable surprise, in Richmond, Virginia, discussing prices in terms that implied a regional reputation she had never heard her family possessed. Her family, in the generation before her grandfather's, had been running one of the more sophisticated cattle breeding operations in central Kentucky. Nobody had told her this. Nobody alive seemed to know it. The knowledge had been buried under Kudzu along with the barn that contained it. Also in the crate, a hand-drawn survey of the property as it had existed in 1891, showing field boundaries and drainage lines, and building placements entirely legible in terms of the land as it existed today. It also showed 3 additional structures she had never heard mentioned, a root cellar, a spring house, and a secondary equipment building, all marked with the precision of someone who expected the map to be useful. She sat on the cleared stone of the barn's front wall in the afternoon light and read those documents until the light was gone, then brought out the lamp she had started carrying up the hill and read them until she was too cold to sit still. She called the County Historical Society, which sent a woman named Ruth Alderman, who arrived with a camera and a notebook and a manner combining genuine scholarly excitement with professional calm. Ruth spent an afternoon with the documents and told Evelyn, without hedging, that what she had found was historically important in ways that went beyond the family's own story. Written records of systematic breeding programs from that era are not common, she said. What your family built here is not something that shows up often. Evelyn thanked her and went back to work on the South Hill. It was another 3 weeks before Ray Cutler came to the farm down her lane, not just past on the county road. He stood in the lane and looked up at the cleared South Hill, at the exposed stone of the barn visible now from below, clean limestone pale in the March light. "I have farmed next to this property for 20 years, he said. "I drove that county road every week. I never knew there was a stone building under that hill." "Neither did I," Evelyn said. "My grandfather knew it was there, but he couldn't get to it." Ray looked at the goats working their way across the east fields. He was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of a man reassessing something he had said in a hardware store 2 years ago. "The goats found it," he said. "They found what they were looking for," Evelyn said. "I just followed them." He was not a man who apologized directly, but he was capable of a different kind of accounting. "What are you going to do with it?" he asked. "I'm going to do what my family built it to do," she said. "Someone spent 40 years developing a bloodline and documenting every step of it. That work doesn't expire." Ray Cutler nodded. He did not entirely understand what she meant yet. He would, over the following years, as the Marsh Farms cattle program developed from the foundation the barn's records provided, come to understand it very well. What happened in the years after was the kind of slow, documented success that accumulates evidence quietly and in the proper order. Evelyn spent 3 more years completing the Kudzu clearance across all 28 fields. She used the 1,891 survey to locate the root cellar and the spring house, both structurally sound beneath decades of overgrowth, and put both to use in the farm's operation. She used the drainage lines and field configurations in the old survey to manage water in ways the county extension office, now paying considerably more attention to the Marsh farm, found worth studying. The cattle breeding program she rebuilt from the family's historical records took several years to establish and several more to produce results visible to the market. But the records themselves were a foundation no amount of capital could have bought. 40 years of documented breeding decisions with performance notes and crossing records that gave her a starting point decades ahead of where she would have been without them. She found buyers who understood what those records meant, people in the regional cattle world who recognized historical breeding programs the way art scholars recognize a provenance. The stone barn became, in time, a landmark, not a tourist attraction, but the kind that people in the region knew about and talked about in the respectful tone that farming communities reserve for things that have outlasted the people who doubted them. Ruth Alderman's research produced a monograph on the Marsh family's breeding program, cited in subsequent work on the agricultural history of central Kentucky. The barn itself, fully cleared and re-roofed on the original stone walls, became the operational center of the farm. On a clear November morning in the 6th year after the discovery, Evelyn walked the South Hill with her grandfather's 1,938 journal open in one hand. She found the spot where he had stood and written that the barn was beyond him, found it by the angle of the old orchard trees in the middle distance, a spot from which the view matched what she imagined he had seen. She stood there for a while. The barn was visible from where she stood, its cleared stone walls pale in the November light. The 28 fields spread below her in their various stages, the oldest clearings now carrying pasture that would have been recognizable to the man who wrote the 1,891 survey, the last few sections still under active goat management at the far eastern edge. Her grandfather had been right that the barn would outlast him. He had not been wrong to give up. He had not had the means to do what she had done. He had seen what was there and lacked the tool to reach it. She had found the tool and known where to point it, and the land had done the rest. That was how she told it, in the years that followed, when people asked her how it had happened. not as a story of her own cleverness, because the cleverness had belonged in part to the goats, and in part to her grandfather who had made the map, and in part to the man in the 1860s who built a barn strong enough to survive what came after. She told it as a story about what the land had been holding and what it takes to listen long enough to find out. The 28 fields the county had written off had been hiding the most valuable thing on the property the entire time, and all it had taken to find it was the patience to clear the ground between herself and what was there.